Tuesday night, Professor Smith was working late in his office when suddenly someone attacks him from behind.
Suddenly, something just went over my head and everything just went black.
Professor Smith's attacker dragged the almost unconscious professor to his van and drove away. Professor Smith was well liked amongst both his peers and his students, so who would do this to him was a total mystery.
I mean, sure, sometimes I would butt heads with some of the other professors in the department, but that was just part of the job. No one really takes it personally.
The person to last see the professor was Joe the janitor.
Well, it was my night shift. I was just cleaning the rooms and halls like usual. And when I passed Professor Smith's office, I heard some screaming and yelling. So I thought better stay away from that room, you know. They were always fighting in that building.
Worked late, Joe would usually knock on the door until I let him in.
Well, I usually tell Dr. Smith, I'm coming in, Doc, and you're going to help me clean up this mess. But they had these donuts out that night for the visiting professors, so I didn't want to attract any attention, Besides, I had that girl Amy's mess to clean up.
Amy Donaldson was one of the professor's students.
Professor
Amy, I'm really busy right now. Amy was, well, let's say enthusiastic about her studies and my research. Amy's behavior was completely unacceptable, and we had to ask her to leave the program, and she was very, very angry about it.
Of course I was angry, but my threats weren't that serious. I don't really get why they hospitalized me.
There was a particular professor in his department that Smith had problems with, Wolfgang Jorgensen. Jorgensen and Smith were the top two contenders for the Pfizer grant. Smith had a slight advantage, having one more published paper. The two were in constant competition. The team at the 99th Precinct were called in to investigate.
Early this morning, we got a phone call about a possible case of domestic abuse. There was screaming heard in a building on campus, and when police arrived at the scene, we found what we have here before us, and it seems like foul play could have been involved. There are signs of a struggle, and so let's look at some of the evidence that we can find. I'm Detective Johnson and acting note taker. Right here we have our sketch artist and our cameraman. They'll be documenting what we see here at the scene, and that will be used in our investigative process. Over here we have our first piece of evidence. It is a pencil, and on the very end there is what seems to be blood. And for this piece of evidence, what we are going to be doing is blood typing. And so based on what we know, we've narrowed our suspects down to 3 people. Professor Wolfgang Jorgensen, Amy, a student who consistently saw Professor Smith after class during his office hours for extra help, and Joe the janitor who works here at night. Over here we have another piece of evidence, what appears to be a document left by Professor Smith. And our handwriting analyst will take a look at this and compare it to the other suspects' samples. The third piece of evidence that we found was a set of fingerprints on the glass right above his desk. And our fourth and final piece of evidence was a strand of hair left on the windowsill that is not the color of Professor Smith's hair, so we will be analyzing that under a microscope to compare the color texture of that strand of hair to the other suspects. And for the fingerprints, we will be fingerprinting the suspects and analyzing the type of fingerprints and the minute points on the fingerprints to see who they could have came from. No.
We have collected fingerprint samples from all 3 suspects to compare with the prints found at the crime scene. Each person's fingerprints has certain and unique characteristics which are different from others. Each suspect's fingerprints will be different from each other's, but we will look for the one that matches closest to the one obtained at the crime scene. To acquire accurate results, we will look closely in detail by identifying the type of fingerprint and the minute points of each print. Microscopic hair analysis. First, we look at the pigment distribution. You'll notice that the pigment in human hair is evenly distributed throughout, whereas in animal hair there is banding. which is simply bands of pigments. Animal hair is also much thicker and has a very visible core. There are 3 parts to the hair: the outside layer or the cuticle, the cortex, a dense cell-packed area just beneath the cuticle, and the medulla, or core. Human hairs can generally be identified by racial origin, body area, and other comparable characteristics. When looked at through a microscope, Caucasian hair will have a lighter shaft, cuticle, and surrounding a darker core. Hair from someone of African descent will be curlier and darker with no visible medulla. From someone of Asian origin, the hair will be dark and straight, also with no visible medulla. We took hair samples from all of our suspects in the crime scene. Right away, we were able to tell that the hair found at the scene was in fact Caucasian. The next thing we look at when analyzing the hair found at a crime scene is what part of the body the hair came from. Once the origin location of the hair is determined, we look at the medulla of the hair. The appearance of the medulla can be classified as continuous, intermittent, or fragmented. The medulla of the hair found at the crime scene is fragmented. We then look at the cuticle of the hair. We note whether or not individual scales completely surround the hair shaft, the general shape of an individual scale, whether the exposed edge of a scale is smooth or jagged. After comparing the characteristics of our suspect's hair and the crime scene sample, we found that the hairs of Wolfgang Jorgensen were the closest match.
Whenever you want.
All right. So looking at the paper taken from Professor Smith's office found at the crime scene, we see some noticeable features of the handwriting that can help identify it as somebody's rather than Professor Smith's. One of these characteristics is the way the A's are written. There is a very distinct A that is written in the note, and it is not a way that most people commonly write their A's. Another thing that stands out is that in this note, all the I's are dotted. And when we look at Professor Smith's note that came from his real handwriting, we notice that in many cases, the I's are not finished. Yet all the T's are similar to in the crime scene note. So these 2 handwriting samples were taken from our other suspects, Joe the janitor, and Amy the student who had a relationship with Professor Smith. And what we noticed right away in looking at the notes from the crime scene compared to the samples taken from the other suspects is that there are very noticeable differences. For Amy's, her letters slant upwards and to the right, and in the crime scene note, it's pretty consistent. The letters are straight up and down, and they don't stray from the line, whereas the words here are often written above the line. So we can be pretty sure that this note was not written by Amy the student. And also for Joe the janitor, there are very noticeable differences. The writing is much, much smaller. There are no loops, there are no curls, no letters are connected, and all the letters are, in fact, finished with the dots and crosses on the I's and T's. All right, and then let's restart that, and then we'll finally. This is the comparison of the note found at the crime scene and the note from Professor Wolf Jorgensen. And these 2 notes seem to be the most similar, both in the handwriting and in the features of their handwriting. And so what we look at here in our 12-point handwriting analysis, almost all of the categories were the same in both notes, with a few slight differences, but that can be attributed to the fact that the real perpetrator of this crime may have tried to switch up their handwriting slightly in order to make it seem like it was someone else.
So to find the blood type of the suspect and the sample from the crime scene, we do blood typing. We put the antibodies from A, B, and RH. This is A. B.
Have you double checked version 2 yet?
And RH.
Version no. And you know
Now,
what?
if any of these clump up, that
He made
means
photocopies. Okay. Well, he made my photocopies.
that the antigen is present or positive. and that's their blood type.
Because none of my early birds are that version.
It seems that this blood type is A positive, Rh positive.
Physician smart to the nurse's office.
Once the results came back from the lab, it was discovered that Wolfgang Jorgensen's hair, blood, handwriting, and fingerprints all matched those found at the crime scene. Wolfgang was later convicted of aggravated assault and attempted kidnapping.